Come back.
Is it recording?
60 minutes. Let's go.
Is it recording? Is it going now?
Nope.
Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Kol malamin es ben beno Torah mal alav hakasuv ki'ilu kiblo mihar Sinai. Shneimar v'eldatom luvanecha luvnei vanecha v'samach le yom asher amato lefnei Hashem elokecha b'chorev.
Today we're going to speak about honoring your grandparents. Now, there are a couple of questions that we have to answer throughout this entire shir. One, is there a requirement to have kavod for the grandparents? Two, who is this requirement for and to whom? And three, assuming that there is kavod, why is there this status of kavod and who comes first? The father or the grandfather? First source we're going to look at is a pasuk in the Torah in Bereshis Memvav Parshas Vayigash. Pasuk says, Vayisa Yisrael v'chol asher lo, and Yaakov traveled with all of his things. Vayavo Beersheva, and he arrived in Beersheva. Vayizbach zvachim le'elokei aviv Yitzchak, and he made a karban for the gods of his father Yitzchak. So a question that we could ask on this pasuk is, why specifically does it say aviv Yitzchak? In most places, when Yaakov is giving a karban, it says both aviv Yitzchak and aviv Avram. So why here specifically does it just say aviv Yitzchak? So Rashi obviously picks up on this question and addresses it. Rashi says, "Chayev adam lekavod aviv yoser mikavod zikna," that a person is chayev more in his kavod for his father than for his grandfather, and therefore lefikach talabi Yitzchak v'lav Avram. So then, therefore, we said Elokei Yitzchak avicha and not Avram, to teach us that the father's kavod is greater than the grandfather's.
The first source that we're going to see about honoring grandparents is the Gemara in Makos on Yom Beis Amud Aleph. Tani Chada. It says in one brayso, Av shaharag beno nasa lo go adam. If the father kills his son, the other son is able to go and kill the father as a go adam. Tani idach, but it says in another brayso, in beno nasa go adam, that the son is not able to be made into go adam. So lema, Rabbi Yossi Hagili, Rabbi Akiva. Let us say that maybe one is talking about Rabbi Yossi Hagili, and one is talking about Rabbi Akiva. And one would say it's a rishus, and one would say it's a mitzvah. However, the tisbara, mitzvah, rishus, mishari. Either way you look at it, would it really be permitted? Why? Because it says, Ba'amar Rabba Bar Rafuna, v'chein tana devei Rabbi Yishmael, la'kol ina ben nasa shliach l'aviv, la'koso l'kalaso, chutz mimesis, shari amar Torah lo simcha lo t'chasa alav. So we see that there's a question of, it says that a son is never able to hit his father or curse his father unless he's a masis, as we see from the pasuk. So therefore, we see that there's a contradiction. One brayso says that you're able to be made into go adam for your father, and another brayso says that you're not able to be made into go adam for your father. So therefore, the Gemara answers, and it says el lo kashya, hab b'no v'hab ben b'no. This one's talking about the son, and one's talking about the grandson. So we're going to see Rashi to explain what that means. So it says in Rashi, El lo kashya hab b'no hab ben b'no. Amar Rashi HaKadosh, Haditanya, ein b'no nasa go adam, b'no shal rotzeach kamar. When it says, the brayso that says that the son is not able to be made into go adam, is talking about the son of the killer. But the Haditanya b'no nasa lo go adam, b'no shal harug kamar, shehu ben b'no shal rotzeach. It's talking about the son of the one who was killed. Therefore, he's the grandson of the killer. And as Rashi says, Ve'eno musar al kvodo. And therefore he does not have to be careful about his honor for his grandfather.
Now we turn to the Gemara on Memta Samad Aleph in Sota. So the Gemara says, Hanu da Amri inshi rachme, da Abba Avni rachme, divne Avni dehavule. So a father loves his son, and that son loves his son. So where do we see this from? Rav Acha bar Yaakov Itzvil be Rav Yaakov bar Barseh. So Rav Yaakov Itzvil, which Rashi explains to me, grew up in his grandfather's house. Kigava, when he grew up, Amar Le, the grandfather said to Rav Yaakov, Ashkin Maya, bring me water. Question on the fly. Amar Lo, Lav Rechana, I don't have to bring it to you. Why? V'hainu da'amri inchi Rabbi bar Techan. Why? Because I'm your grandson and I don't have a cave of kavod to you, as Rashi will explain in a second. So, to see Rashi, Rabbi, Amar Rashi HaKadosh, Gadol, Osi, V'afal Pikein Eini Bencha. Even though I grew up in your house, I'm not considered your son. So what does this imply? Bar Techana. I'm your daughter's son. Ve'ein alai l'kvodecha keben. And I don't have the same kavod as if I was a son. So we see from this that because he was not considered son and a grandson on the maternal side, that he is not considered to have the same kavod or any kavod at all for this grandfather.
Now that we saw these two Gemaras in Makos and Sota, that seemed to imply that there would be no chiyuv of kavod for a grandson and his grandfather. We're going to see other sources that come to bring more proofs to that fact. So the first source is the Ma'arik in Shoresh Mem Daled, and he discusses about whether a grandson has to say Kaddish for his grandfather. So he starts, Nearly ani estati, Gafiu hainu omrim sheyish lomar Kaddish ba'avor zikno, o ziknaso, divnei vanim harehin kavanim, mikol makom lo have kavanim mamash. That even according to the ones who would say that a grandson would have to say Kaddish for his grandfather, because of this din that we see in the Gemara in Yuvalos, that grandsons are like sons, they would not say that these grandsons are actually like sons, like literally. And the son would come before the grandson, and that's something very simple. Ein leben haben lomer Kaddish b'shvil zikno yosem yadam acher sherharei matzinu she'amiras hakadish tola b'chiv hakavod. The Ma'arik says, according to himself, that a grandson would not have to say Kaddish for his grandfather because the grandson's like any other person in the whole entire Klal Yisrael would have to say Kaddish for his grandfather. Why? Because he says that Kaddish is dependent on his din of kavod, and he says that a grandson does not have a din of kavod for his grandfather. Shari Amru HaPostim Shnei Achim Notlim Shnei Chalakim Kaddish Mishum Shekol Echad Chayiv B'Chor Aviv. So he brings a proof, and he says that the reason why, the source that we see that the saying of Kaddish is Talei on Kavod is from this fact that if two brothers have this father who passed away, they both have to split up this Kaddish, the saying of the Kaddish, because both of them have a Chayiv Kavod. ומאחר שהדבר תלוי בכבוד אביו, אם כן נראה שבן הבן שאינו חי בכבוד זקנו, שהרי לא מצינו בשום מקום שיש חייב, אלא בכבוד האב, ואין באישס אביו, בחיו, ועל אמו בחיו, ואחיו הגדול. And after we see that it's totally obviously on kavod, and the grandson does not have a chiyuv of kavod on his grandfather, only on these certain other individuals, he would not have to say Kaddish for his grandfather. Aval ben haben bechvod zaken, lo ze matzinu b'shum makom. Again, he reiterates the fact that he does not find any sources that would say that a grandson would have to say Kaddish or have a chiyuv of kavod for his grandfather. And he now brings a proof to himself. Or he becomes to disprove a Gemara that would say that grandsons are like sons. So, the Gemara that says that grandsons are like sons, Hainu dafka l'inyan pirya v'rivin, t'haktani lo k'di'isa v'rachos avolo inyan acher. So there's a Gemara in Yuvamos Samach Beis Amud Beis that discusses what happens if a grandfather had only a son, and that son had a daughter and a son. And then the son of the grandfather passes away, and he's left with two grandchildren. One's a boy and one's a girl. And according to the Mishnah in Yevamos, that's all you need for Puruvu, one boy and one girl. So if the son passes away and he's left with, and now the grandfather is left with two grandchildren, a boy and a girl, we say he's Mekayim his mitzvah of Puruvu, because grandchildren are like sons. So the Ma'arik is saying that even though in that instance grandsons are like sons, that's the only case that applies, only by Puruvu. V'teda dechein hu shahari ben haben kasher lehei l'zikno l'divrei ma'abar Rashi k'de'isa parag yesh nochen ve'af agav d'les hilchsa kavasar. And he brings a proof to himself, and he says that Ma'abar Rashi is going according to the opinion that says that a grandson would be able to testify for his grandfather. Mikol makom shita shecharach lu yashiv hebrayse the ma'aseh parak haba yivamto v'vnei var meharehin kavanim elavade linyan puruvu dafka itmar kadisa le'el. And as he stated before, that the Gemara in Yevamos that says grandchildren are like sons is only by Puruvu, and therefore the Gemara Ma'abar Rashi, who says that grandchildren would be able to testify about their grandfather, they would be allowed to do that because they have no chiyuv of kavod for their grandfather. So that's the first source that we see that comes to reiterate this fact that a grandson would not have a chiyuv of kavod for his grandfather. So just to sum up the Maharik says that a grandson would not have to say Kaddish for his grandfather because the grandson has no chiyuv of kavod for his grandfather, and since the din of Kaddish is taloi on kavod, a grandson would not have to say Kaddish for his grandfather. And he disproves the Gemara in Yevamos that would say that grandchildren seem to be like sons. And he says that the only reason why, in that case, grandchildren are like sons is because it's talking about Kuruvu. But that would not apply to any other case that would be brought. And one last point that the Marik makes is he brings a proof that Marbar Ravashi says that grandchildren are able to testify about their grandfather, and he implies from that it's because that they don't have a chiyuv of kavod for their grandfather. The second source we see is the Shulchan Aruch Yoredeya Reishman Hilchos Kibbud Avim, and it says that a person would be chayiv to honor his in-laws, and the Biurei Hagra on that says that there are those who say that you would not have to honor your grandfather from this Shulchan Aruch. And he brings two rayas. The first raya is, as we saw before, the Gemara in Makos, on Yud Beis Amud Aleph, that says that a grandson would not have to honor his grandfather, as we see from he's able to be his Goel Adam. The second source is Gemara in Sota on Mem Tes Amud Aleph, that says that his grandson did not bring his grandfather a cup of water. Okay, so now, third source we're going to see that seems to support the idea that a grandson would not have to honor his grandfather is the Rambam in Shoftim Hilchos Ma'amarim Perek Hey Halacha Gimel, and he says that if somebody curses his grandfather or his grandmother, it's as if he's cursing any person in all of Klal Yisrael. We saw the similar Lashon in the Marik that said that somebody who's saying Kaddish, a grandson who's saying Kaddish for his grandfather, is no different than any other person in Klal Yisrael. So the Kesef Mishnah on this Rambam quotes the Gemara in Makos as a proof to the fact that the reason why his grandson would be is the same as any other person in all of Klal Yisrael cursing his grandfather or his grandmother is because of the Gemara in Makos on Yud Beis Amud Aleph. That seems to say that a grandson has no chiyuv of kavod for his grandfather. So just to sum up the opinions who would say that a grandson does not have to honor his grandfather, no kavod. The first raya that we brought was from the Ma'arik, who says that a grandson would not have to say Kaddish for his grandfather, and the reason is because he has no chiyuv of kavod. And he brings a raya from Marbar Ravashi, who says that a grandson is allowed to testify about his grandfather. So the first proof is Ma'arik. Marbar Ravashi. Second proof we saw from the Gra on the Shulchan Aruch, and he says that the two, as we saw before, the two Gemaras, one in the Gemara in Makos and one is the Gemara in Sota, that says that there would be no chiyuv of kavod for a grandson on a grandfather. Biurei Hagra. Makos 12a, and Gemara in Sota 49a. Third proof to the fact that a grandson would not have to honor his grandfather is the Rambam in Hilchos Shoftim, Hilchos Ma'amarim, and he says that if somebody curses his grandmother or his grandfather, it says if he curses anybody in Klal Yisrael, and the Kesef Mishnah brings the proof to the Rambam from the Gemara in Makos. So, Hilchos Ma'amarim. That cursing would be the same as any other person. Okay, anybody have any questions? Good. Well, I actually have a question. So the Gemara in Sota said that if this grandson who grew up in his grandfather's house was asked to bring him a cup of water, he said, I don't have to give you a cup, so therefore I'm not going to bring you a cup of water. But we see that there's a Gemara in Megillah and Yud Gimel and Aleph that says that if somebody raises a child, that child becomes like his son, and therefore that child who he raised would now have a chiyuv of kavod to the person who raised him. And we also see a Ramah that says that if somebody signs on a shtar, if this person who was brought up by somebody signs on a shtar that this person who brought him up was my father, the Ramah says that shtar is good. So we see that a grandson, that somebody who raises a child is as if that child is his son. So therefore, this Tana in the Gemara and Sota should have had to bring his grandfather a cup of water because the grandfather, as Rashi says, brought him up. So therefore, he should have a chiyuv of kavod in the Gemara and Sota. So that might not be a raya for this opinion.
Now, before we go on to the different deos that say that there is a mitzvah to give kavod to the grandparents, we first have to analyze what this mitzvah of kavod would be and how this mitzvah of kavod would be achieved through or a substitute of the parents. So now, we're going to go look back in Gemara Yevamos on Daf Samach Beis Amud Beis, the one that Yoni quoted before by the Maharik, which he disproved. Now, the Gemara says that there are grandparents, and these grandparents, in order to be Mekayim, the mitzvah of Pru Revu, they have to have a son and a daughter, and a granddaughter and a grandson. So now, there are two different interpretations on how this mitzvah of being Mekayim the Pru Revu can be fulfilled. One is the Rambam. The Rambam says that in order to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Pru Revu, you need a Zaidi, for our purposes, Zaidi Zeidman. He has to have a son and a daughter. And they, either one can have a son or a daughter as well. And this is the only way that you are Mekayim the mitzvah of Pru Revu. That there is one grandson and one granddaughter. So now, because of this, we see that the only way to get to the grandfather is through the parents. So since it's only through the parents, for our extensive purposes, and since the Rambam does not differentiate between kavod and Pru Revu, this means that the way that kavod is fulfilled by the grandchildren is through the grandparents. Now, in a second we'll explain the ramifications for this. But first we have to go to Tosfos. Tosfos says on the page, on the Daf Samach Beis in Yevamos, he says that the way that a grandfather, Zaidi Zeidman, can be Mekayim the mitzvah of Pru Revu is you can have one daughter and one son again, but the difference is that you can have, let's say, two grandsons. And if, chas v'shalom, one of these sons or daughters die, then this grandson can take the place of this son, and he is still Mekayim the mitzvah of Pru Revu. So because of this, for our purposes, what Tosfos seems to be saying, again because he does not differentiate between Pru Revu and kavod, unlike what the Maharik did, it seems that the way that this kavod is taking place, and is being Mekayim from the grandson to the grandfather, is that the grandson is taking the place of the parents. Not that it's going through the parents, but it's taking the place. So now, this begs a very important nafkamina for us, with the Gemara Makos. Good base. According to the Rambam's interpretation on what the kavod is and how it is achieved, this Gemara makes perfect sense, and it could still be that you need to honor your grandparents. How? If you may recall, the Gemara in Makos speaks about how if the grandfather kills his son, then the son of the dead can be a gol adam for the grandfather. So now, according to the Rambam, this makes perfect sense. If one of the sons or daughters die, then he is no longer connected to the grandfather. And if he is no longer connected to the grandfather, according to the Rambam, there's no mitzvah of kavod. And that's why he could act as a gol adam. So even though, according to Tosfos, we may not be able to interpret the Gemara Makos to our favor to say that it is unnecessary to have kavod for the grandparents, at least according to one man da'amar, we are able to explain the Gemara Makos in a favorable way and explain that you actually do need to honor your grandparents, even though it is possible to act as a gol adam. Now that we have analyzed how this kavod would be achieved, either according to the Rambam or according to Tosfos, now we could look into if in fact there even is a kavod that has to be given from the grandson to the grandfather. So the first source that we're going to see is the Tor Shulchan Aruch in Yoredeir Siman Rishman, Hilchos Kivud Avei, Sif Chav Daled. He writes, "V'chayev l'kaved chamav." You are obligated to honor your in-law, your father-in-law. Dichsiv, v'avi ra gam. Father-in-law is considered like a father according to the Torah. So too we must honor him like a father, which is a mitzvah in the Torah as well. Now we're going to look at the Bach that quotes the Ma'arik, which we saw before. The Bach writes, "Kasav Ma'arik b'shorish mem daled shenira she'ein ben aben chay b'kavod zikna." So like what we said before, the Bach holds that the grandson has no chiyuv of kavod to the grandfather. Shehare lo matzinu b'shum makom she'is chayav, because he hasn't seen in any place that the grandson is chayav in kavod. Venerally, so now the Bach is going to write, is going to respond to this. That it addresses this in Bereshis Rabbah by saying what? On this pasuk, Al vayizvach zvakim lelokei aviv Yitzchak. Like the pasuk that we read, the first source that we read, that Yaakov made a carbon for the God of his father Yitzchak. So Rabbi Yochanan writes on this, Shechayev adam bekavod aviv yoser mikavod zikna. That a person is chayev in kavod more on the father than on the grandfather. V'chein perish Rashi the Chumash. And Rashi also writes this in Chumash, like what we saw before. So mashma though, lahedja dechayev l'kvodo. But we see for sure that if they're measuring the kavod of the zikno versus the kavod of your father, that there has to be at least a little bit of kavod for your grandfather. Fine, so that's the first proof of the Bach, that there is at least some aspect of kavod for your grandfather. The second proof, Besu da'arei limdo medrash Shocher Tov. We learned in a medrash in Shocher Tov, the chayav l'kaved chamov. Like what we saw over here also, that you're chayav to give kavod to your in-law, your father-in-law. Why? Because it calls a chamav his father in the Torah. So, that the zikno, that the grandfather should be even more than the chamav. Why? Shari zikno nikra, because by grandfather it is written, aviv b'torah k'diksiv, and it is also called aviv in the Torah, where ani Hashem elokei Avram avicha, and he calls Avram his father. V'elokei Yitzchak haaretz asher atah yochev. So we see that he calls Avram his father. So according to this logic, by chamav, that it's considered his father, and therefore you give kavod like a father to the chamav, so too you should have kavod for your grandfather, because it's also called his father in the Torah. So before we go into the other proofs of the Bach first addresses what the Ma'arik has said and tries to disprove it. So we're going to skip what the Ma'arik actually said and just go to the disproof of the Bach. So we're going to skip down a total of 4 lines and go to Lefia Nias Daiti. So Lefia Nias Daiti, according to the Bach, Devada le'inyan Eidos Galil Ankara, that according to Eidos, which the Ma'arik was quoting, that there is definitely a pasuk to back that up, that you're able to testify against your grandfather, or for your grandfather. What's the pasuk? Lo yimosu avos albanim. So according to some may conclude that there is backing that you can testify for or against your grandfather. So however, banim davka, v'lo b'nei banim. So banim alone, and not b'nei banim. V'zil basar taimei da as plague dura. But we don't hold like this opinion. So how is this a good proof according to the Ma'arik? Aval le'inyan kivud, but the inyan of kivud, kavedes avicha v'yasimecha kisiv. It says kavedes avicha. What does this mean? Umiribuya, this includes the es, the word the es. Marvina, this word includes what? Afilu bal imo, either your mother's husband, the eishes aviv, or your husband or your father's wife, v'afilu achlev gadol, or even your older brother. Kol shekain avi aviv, tehu nikra avicha mamish. So kol shekain, you have to give honor to someone who the Torah calls an aviv. So how is this proof of the Ma'arik good if we don't even hold like this opinion? And not only that, but the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which we learned earlier this year, an explicit Mishnah, seems to go against this, that you're not able to testify for your grandfather. So really, the Ma'arik has no backing for his claim that there is no claim to have kavod. So now that the Bach has completely obliterated the Ma'arik, he's going to go on and bring two more proofs for the mitzvah of having kavod for your grandfather. So he goes on. He says, Visu, and furthermore, Kivan de Zikno Chayv Limdo Torah, Kideisa Beparak Kamad de Kedushin, since the Zaken, since the grandfather, has a mitzvah to teach his grandson Torah, are we really going to say that the Zaken has a mitzvah to teach his grandson Torah? And we're going to say that this grandson who's learning Torah from this grandfather, where this grandfather has a position of being a Rebbe, that he has no mitzvah on kavod? That's ridiculous. So the Bach says that it obviously means that there is a mitzvah of kavod. He goes on for a fourth reason. He says, V'su de'ikir tam ha'kavod, that for the tam of kavod, she'ashava kivod ava'im, l'kavod ha'makom. Now we see that there is kavod by kivod ava'im and kavod ha'makom. Why? For Hashem. Why? Mishum shlosha shotim k'moshe nisbar b'tzkila siman zeh. Because there's three partners in the act of pruravu, and which we said earlier in the siman. Imkain, mitam zeh, gam avi aviv b'chlal shospos. So that means that anyone above the mother or the father, anyone that's above these shotfos, obviously you have to have respect for them too. If there's someone above these shotfos who you must have respect for, then anyone that's on a higher level than these shotfos, obviously not Hashem, but the other two, then there must be an aspect of kavod for them as well, i.e., their parents. So now just to summarize the four proofs of the Bach. Bach had four proofs for why there would be an inyan of kavod for the grandfather. That a grandson must have kavod for his grandfather. So proof number one of the Bach was from Rashi and Bereshis, which stated that since there is an aspect of both kavod zikno and kavod chamav, even though kavod chamav weighs it out, we still see that there's an aspect of kavod zikno as well. The second proof was the comparison between chamav and your grandfather. Because chamav is referred to aviv in the Torah, and we explicitly see, with no arguments around the board, that you have to give kavod to your chamav because it refers to chamav as aviv in the Torah. So too, the grandfather, who it refers to aviv in the Torah as well, you must give kavod to the grandfather as well. The third reason and proof that Bach gives is from Gemara Kedushin, which states that the grandfather has a mitzvah of lamed Torah to his grandson. And since he has a mitzvah of lilmod Torah to his grandson, it must be, according to the Bach, that this grandson has a mitzvah of kavod to his grandfather for being his Rebbe and for being his grandfather. So that's the third proof of the Bach. The fourth proof of the Bach is from Shofim. And since there are three partners in the act of pruravu, and you have to give kavod to all three, therefore anyone greater than two of these shoftim, anyone greater than two of these, you must also give kavod to. And who's greater than the mother and the father? Who's greater in the mother and father's eyes? Obviously their parents. So it must be that you give kavod to them as well. So obviously from the Bach we see that it seems from all these proofs that there is definitely an inyan to give kavod to your grandparent. And not only is there an abundant proof for the mitzvah of kavod for the grandfather, but there's also disproofs for the other side, which we stated before. One of the sources that the no kavod side quoted was the Gemara in Makos. But according to the Rambam, which we said, it seems that we could still interpret the Gemara Makos to mean that there is a mitzvah of kavod in most regular circumstances. That was the first source. The second source that we saw was the Ma'arik. The Ma'arik spoke about how since by Eidos there's no Indian kavod, so too everywhere else. But the Bach shlugged it up. He said only by Eidos we could say that pasuk. And only by Eidos we could say that there is no kavod in that place. But everywhere else there is definitely kavod. And we don't even hold like that opinion. And there's a Gemara Sanhedrin that says exact opposite to what the Ma'arik says. So we see that there is an enormous amount of proof against the proofs of the Ma'arik. The third proof that was given by the no kavod side was the Gemara Sota. Now, as Yoni mentioned before, there's a Gemara Megillah which goes completely against the Gemara Sota. And not only that, but the Gemara Sota only seems to imply that the maternal grandfather has no mitzvah of kavod, as Rashi seems to point out. However, it might be different by paternal, where everyone may agree that there is a mitzvah of kavod for the grandparents.
As Josh mentioned before, we are now going to get into the last topic of the shir, and that is whether maternal grandparents have the same din of kavod as paternal grandparents. So this seems to be machlokas between the Biuri Hagra and Rashi. The Biuri Hagra, on the one hand, which was quoted before, the same exact Biuri Hagra, says that there would not be a din of kavod for maternal grandparents. And Rashi would say that there would be a din of kavod for maternal grandparents. The reasoning for the Gra is because once a mother gets married to her husband, her din of kavod now transfers to her Baal. She doesn't have a din of kavod for her father anymore. Therefore, the way the chakir that we used before with Josh of the Rambam and Tosos can be applied to this case over here now. Either according to the Rambam, who says that you go through the mother. Once you go through the mother, the chain breaks because the mother now only has a din of kavod for her husband and not her father. So therefore, the grandchild will not have a din of kavod for her grandfather because the chain breaks. Throughout this whole shir, we've seen that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence for the side that a grandchild would still have to honor their grandfather, and they have a din of kavod for that. We saw the 4 proofs of the Bach supporting that side.
Not only that, but we also saw that all of the points of the other side, that there is no kavod, was refuted. So seemingly, there should definitely be a kavod for the grandfather, at least for sure on the paternal side. Turn it off. We're done.